Hello and welcome to another episode of A Junior, a Senior and I. I'm extremely pleased to be joined today by Philippe and Jose to talk about tests first and why testing first before you code matters. In order to do that, let's first meet our guests. Jose, could you introduce yourself in 3 sentences or less, please?
Yes, I'm Jose. I'm based in London. I work for Thoughtbot as a developer, and I'm originally from Spain, Madrid. I'm very happy to be here. Nice to meet you, Philippe, and nice to meet you, Pablo.
Thanks. Nice to meet you too, Jose. Philippe, could you do the same, please?
Yes, sure. So my name is Philippe. I've been a Ruby dev for a bit more than 10 years. And since a few years ago, I've started working in management. So now I'm CTO of NodalView, a company based in Brussels that helps real estate agents process pictures mostly.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm gonna assume you both test first before coding. If not, the episode might be
It
a
will be
bit short.
interesting.
But why do you test first, Jose? What are the advantages you find in that?
I think we can put this either from business perspective or also developer perspective. From a developer perspective, myself, it helps me a lot to think how I'm gonna approach things, what I'm gonna develop. It gives me a lot of confidence on what I'm doing is right and I'm following the right path. And I know once I have all my tests done, it acts as a living documentation for whoever is gonna take that part of the code after. It can be in one day, it can be in 10 years, but at least you have some living documentation there. And also, actually, something that is important as well, it helps you with the flow a lot. You know, you have the red green refactor. You enter in a zone that when you're creating a feature or fixing a bug, first you create your test, you have a red test. Then you do the minimum code to make that test pass, you have a green. Then next step, you create another test that is red. And that flows, when it starts to flow, it's actually a really good zone that you can enter when you are a developer to focus on what you are doing. And I don't think we talk a lot about that as a developers, but with test-driven development, like it helps you a lot to just go on with your work. And again, it feels good. I don't know, at least for me. And then from a business perspective, I would say like it saves a lot of money and it saves a lot of time as well because you can catch bugs much earlier when you have a good testing suite your application. I guess like as a summary, that's kind of my thinking. I don't know, Philippe, what you think, or even you, Pablo.
Yeah, I guess this is going to be the episode of confirmation bias because we're going to agree on a lot of stuff.
Yeah, I was thinking the same.
But okay, so the question is, why do I test first, right? So I'm going to assume we all agree that having test is a good idea. So like the question is, why testing first? Well, because it's easier than testing after the fact. It's easier to test testable code. And like a good way to have testable code is to start with the test. So this is why I test first, because it drastically increases my chances of having testable code, which in my opinion is very often correlated to good quality code. It's not a causation, it's a correlation in my opinion. Like testable code is very often good quality code. And then I test first because it makes me do testable code and then high quality code. And I also agree with your last remark, Jose, that the cost of fixing bugs, the cost of changing code rises with time. It costs much less to change code when you're writing it than 2 weeks later, and it costs even more 6 months later or 2 years later. So I believe that test first process brings bugs earlier at a point that it costs less to fix them. And also as a process, it's a very repeatable process. So when I wasn't, because I haven't been testing first my whole career, my whole life, when I wasn't, then my life as a developer was more chaotic. Sometimes I liked it, but eventually I arrived at the conclusion that I love what is repeatable. I love having a rhythm, and test first makes my developer life less chaotic, more my days or my weeks or my months, it depends what your favorite period, but are more similar to each other.
I'm going to pick up a small thread that you both kind of led me to. You, Jose, with the flow, and you, Philippe, with the less chaotic. One of the main advantages I find when I test first is that my switching costs, because I'm in a position where I interrupt my coding frequently, my switching costs are extremely reduced, because when I go back into the code, I usually have a red test, and usually my next step is making it green, right? So I don't have to spend time trying to figure out, okay, what was I in the middle of, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that, in one hand, brings me back into the flow faster, and on the other, makes my life less chaotic because the interruptions last less. You said, Philippe, that the testing first makes the code more testable, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and that's. But arguably, if you write good code, it should be testable anyways, right?
That's an argument we could have, but in my experience, right? So this is very anecdotal. I haven't read much about it, but I believe that having things by accident, so if you write good code, quality code, and then it's testable by accident because you didn't specifically target that objective. So you might have testable code, absolutely, you might have it, but it's less guaranteed that designing for it. So I would prefer like designing for testable code and getting good quality code by accident than the opposite. Now, I'm not having good quality code by accident because testing first, when I write test, I prefer calling them examples, by the way, but when I write examples, I have a set of constraints, I have a certain like stylistic ID in mind, because I also believe that examples are very documentative. So I have some constraint. I have like one way of writing that text, because example test, it's text, right? So my brain is in a certain mode when I'm writing examples, and then it leads me, those examples will apply some forces to my writing code. And when I'm writing code, I'm still also in the mood of writing good quality code. So I'm writing good quality test, and tests have their own set of what good quality means. And then I'm writing good quality code. So both of those texts helps the other to be good quality, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think we could say like test first helps to drive much better design in your code than if you don't have the test. As Philippe said, like if you write first the code, even if you are a great software engineer and you know everything like in terms of architecture, etc., then obviously it's testable code, but as he said, is just by chance. It happens to happen that way. While if you have your test first, you are making sure that your code is good quality. You are making sure you are following some constraints, as you said. I like that. And you are making sure also that you're writing, when you're refactoring, you're writing the less code that you need to implement or fix what you are doing. And from my point of view, all of that is because you are putting yourself those tests first, those constraints. We can call it like that way as well. You're setting yourself up for success to deliver something that you are making sure is going to work. Of course, then ahead of on time, you could have introduced a bug because you miss an edge case or something like that. Those are things that in software development happen, and we are not perfect. But you are 90% sure or 99% sure that what you are delivering is actually the right thing. It has the right architecture.
Funnily enough, I would not bet that my code is like 90% like the right one on the first attempt, but at least it will be testable because it's tested, so it's testable. So it means that whatever I'm missing, I will quite easily be able to introduce additional examples for making what's missing. Maybe I'm missing 30%, maybe I'm missing 10%. I don't know yet, but because the whole code is designed in a testable way, it means that I will be able to add additional examples. And although I didn't like exactly answer the question, but that you asked, so I want to say that in my experience, writing test first is highly correlated like with having good quality code. But writing good quality code is not highly correlated with having testable code. So the correlation is not bidirectional.
I see. I'm going to keep playing devil's advocate for a little bit in order for us three not to agree on everything. But Jose, you said that testing first your code allows you to be faster. That's rather counterintuitive, right? Because you're doubling the amount of work you do. Arguably, if you're doing test first, you are probably even writing more tests than you would do if you just wrote the feature and then the test. Could you make sense of that quote unquote contradiction?
I am faster because it's actually helping me to think in advance on what I'm going to implement and all the steps I need to follow to implement that thing. If I had it, if I can visualize it in my brain. That's why I think I'm faster. If I have to implement something out of the blue without starting with tests, I think right now, at this point of my career, I will black out. I wouldn't know what to follow. And I do that on spikes, let's say, where I have to do something very, very fast or something that maybe I know it's not going to go into production. I will just do some spiking code and that's it. But if it's something that I'm working on that I know it has to go into production, I'm definitely being faster by writing my test first and having those steps I know I need to follow to make something successful. It's true, I'm writing more code, but at the same time, as I said before, you are refactoring yourself the code at the same time you are writing tests. So that the step you are implementing it in all the loop of red, green, and then refactor by having the tests. So I think on the long term, you are actually much faster by having tests than not having them. And then again, we are talking about preventing bugs and what we've been talking about in these few minutes. Like just by having tests, you are preventing all of that for sure is going to cost you more work and time in the future. I have to say, like, before knowing testing, my life was so miserable, honestly. Debugging and not having something that would help me finding out what was going wrong or how to approach something. I remember when I was learning in the bootcamp, like, we didn't touch much testing. And when you had to figure out what was going on in there, it was like, even for the teachers that were helping us, and there were like easy apps, it was so difficult, honestly, to just manually test something and find the bug. Even for someone that is starting and wrote their first app, like for a teacher, would be kind of easy. Okay, let's go and find the bug. But sometimes it was so difficult. And all of that because you didn't have tests in this first app. Like if you have some tests, you're writing something new, it breaks, then you find it, and it saves you so much time. So, yeah, I think that will be my thinking process about why tests save a lot of time, more than thinking from the side of, oh, I'm writing double the code, then I'm spending double the time on this. I wouldn't look at it from that perspective, yeah.
I see. I think you make quite good points. I also, in my experience, when I'm writing tests, first, I'm faster even though I'm writing more tests and probably more code because then more code, more boilerplate, quote unquote, because I'm going to have more classes, I'm going to have things that are more modular, that are more separated. And so I'll have more files or I'll have more bigger amount of code, although I'm going faster, right? How many red tests you have on any given at any given point? Are you of the school of thought that there is only one failing test, or of the school of thought of I have one system test and then I'm diving into the unit tests that are red, etc., etc.? Let's start with Philippe, for example.
I'm having like one red test of each layer. I'm gonna say it that way because the first example I'm gonna write is typically it's a user story, right? So even imagine you start a project from scratch. You basically have nothing. Maybe your first story is as a registered user, I log in and I see my welcome screen. So I'm starting to write that test, that example, that story, and there's nothing, right? So even like go to root page, there's no root page. So I'm gonna introduce maybe a router, etc. And I have some threshold, some timing in my head that I need a new test for specifically the step I'm in. So as soon as I introduce maybe the router and the root page, I might be adding a new spec, a new story that says, oh, there's a root page, and it shows the login screen. So second, red test, right? Because it's red as well. And long story short, maybe it will move me to introduce an interactor. Sometimes those are called use case controller, or sometimes those are called services. Those definitely always get their own example. And maybe I will need a new service for persistence because I just said registered user. So maybe I'm going to have a red test for that. So I might have multiple red tests, but I'm not doing two stories at the same time, or two services at the same time, or two persistence at the same time. It's just that my upper spec will invite me to write more specific, more unit test. For me, unit is not like specific. Like there's a range. So some tests are more isolated, some tests are more integrated. But I will go down the rabbit hole and have more isolated tests driven by less isolated tests. So this is typically how I feel. And when I'm lost because something urgent happened, maybe the weekend happened, well, I just run all my specs and then I remember like where I was and which of those red is currently the most urgent to fix.
I think it's something organic, right? Like what you were saying, like you have your system spec and just start from the very, very beginning. And then while you are developing, then at some point you might have 3 red tests because you need to actually to make that system spec continue working. You need to write 3 different little pieces of code that they will have their own unit tests. And then at that point you have 4 failing tests. Okay, fine. But then you go little by little and it all flows and is very organic. Again, like telling a nice story to yourself.
I see. And when you are both saying that, what I'm thinking is that probably there is a time that each of those tests, other than the level they're at, they have a time characteristic on them. So a longer test will, between brackets, contain multiple medium long tests that will contain multiple fast tests each, because it's a loop within a loop and the loops inside are smaller? Or is that not a good way to think about it?
If time was not a problem, I would likely have a lot of like user stories integrated test, because those are really exercising and messaging like many aspects of the app. And when you're doing a more isolated test, you're like testing your subject, but you're not testing how your subject acts and behaves with others. So my favorite kind of spec is definitely integrated, but it just takes forever. Like those naturally takes much longer because you might have an interaction between a browser and a server and a database and maybe an external system, whatever. So I think the reason why I'm doing more integrated tests is basically because I cannot afford to spend that time. So yes, of course, more isolated tests are much more faster because that is their point. Their point is that I get to run 1,000 unit tests for the price of one user story.
I think I did not express myself correctly. What I meant more was in time of producing and making that test green instead of the time they take to run. So what I meant is that you're writing a system test that says the user logs in and goes to the welcome page, right? And that will contain, as you said, one interactor or service or whatever you're using for registering the user, another for sending an email. And each of those will have a spec that will take slightly shorter to be resolved than the biggest system test. And those will have unit tests in which you have a user has a username, a user has an email, which also will take you less time to make green. I don't know if I'm making myself clear. I'm getting confused by myself. So
You mean, Pablo, maybe like perhaps like substituting your massive system spec by those unit tests you have of this those
no. What I
small.
mean is that you have four. Imagine you have four red tests of different layers. Some of them, by their intrinsic characteristics, will go to green faster than the higher ones. So, for example, a user has a username is a test that you will make green in roughly 10 seconds, right? And that is contained in the user has persistence. But user has persistence also has user has a last name, user has a telephone, etc. And so the analogy I'm trying to draw is that you go from a long loop, which is the system test, towards a really short loop, and the accumulation of those short loops closes the longer loops.
Okay, so your loop is how much time or effort, let's imagine that
Yes.
these are the same, does it take to make the existing region example go from red to green and also refactor? That is what you refer to as a loop.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Then yes, of course. I think the point of an example is to exercise part of the application that you're writing. So system specs are exercising a very wide area of your application. So if you have nothing, it means you have to write a very large area of your application to make it green if you have nothing. While a very unit test about, you said it, first name, it's exercising a very small area of your application. So again, if you're writing a new feature, like not fixing something, not keeping the lights on, if you're writing something new, it means you will have fewer, like less code to write, because that test is exercising a smaller aspect of your app. So yeah, definitely it takes less effort to close a unit spec than to close a system spec.
Yeah, I completely agree with Philippe in this case. Like a system spec will take you all the way. I mean, at the end, a system spec, we are covering a large part of the app. Normally, when you are covering a whole journey, a whole user journey. So yeah, as you said, like that means that you are missing a big part of, like, even multiple features you actually need to implement. So of course, it's gonna take much more time than any unit test.
I think namings matter. I've experimented with a few names trying to see if I could get my story better to my team. And like system spec, I don't like the name system spec. It doesn't mean anything. So I tried calling them flow specs, because there's a flow chart, like everybody knows what's a flow chart, so it makes sense. Or glue specs, because those specs specifically test the glue between the pieces. So
Oh,
we
that's
have
nice. I like
pieces
it.
specs and then glue spec. Eventually, I'm still using systems spec because that's the word everybody uses, and it helps. Like it's a good quality of a word if everybody uses that word. But I think like it might answer also your question. Consider like the system spec actually test the glue between the pieces.
Yeah, sure. And you both spoke a bit about the advantages of doing test first. From someone that is convinced, so both of you, that testing first is important or best or better or whatever you want to put in there, what are the drawbacks you see that make you think, oh, if I could remove this, it would be even more efficient?
I think drawbacks. The only thing I can think of that we touch a little bit is when you have a very demanding system spec, it can affect your build, how long it takes to build when you deploy, because it has a massive cost on time to run like a big system spec. Other kind of drop, I don't know. I will say, I think I mentioned this to you in another call actually, like the learning curve of test-driven development for new starters, for new developers, is quite high from my point of view. Again, like maybe someone else will have other opinion. It's not something that is easy to grasp, especially when you're starting your journey as a developer. And to be honest, I mean, there is a lot of content about test-driven development, especially in Ruby on Rails, but not in many other languages. And I don't think there is good quality content, like a lot of good quality content out there to learn good test-driven development. Like even if you go into the documentation of RSpec, I remember at the beginning of starting learning just testing like the library. I was like, but what is this? Like, how do I feel by reading this documentation how to test my stuff? So yeah, that's not a drawback. It's just the reality of how it is.
To be fair, if I remember correctly, our spec sells itself as a behavior driven development framework instead of a test driven development one. The best resource I found on test-driven development is Big Surprise, the book on test-driven development, which was written by, I hope I'm not saying anything stupid, but by Martin Fowler. I'm not sure.
Could be, yeah. Big name for sure.
Whomever the author is, the link, I will try to link on the show notes to the book. But yeah, that book actually helped me finally understand it. Because as you said, learning curve of how, when, and what to test when you test first is quite high.
I think so. And as I said, like even when you are doing self-learning or even a bootcamp, like there is not that much, to say, focus on testing, on having the students learning how to test first and then, of course, because there is also a constraint of time in this kind of courses, right? I don't know how it is at uni level when you are learning software engineering and other stuff, like if they have time to learn testing as well. I don't know how they approach that.
I can answer that.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, because I've also been teaching at undergrad school, so 2 years
Nice.
program. And at least in the school that I was working in, test was approached as a tool, basically. So we mostly used Java for teaching a lot of concepts. So we used JUnit. And it was approached as this is everything you can do with JUnit, and I think it was a very bad way to approach it. Of course, it's not an easy tool, right? But it's a very obvious way to approach testing. It's the same as, oh, this is Minitest or this is RSpec. Learn DDS. You can use let, you can use it, you can use, but then you still can't do nothing. Because the problem is like not what can you do, but what should you do? That is a very tough question. What should you do? What should you not do? Well, like, because there's a lot of stuff which are stupid to test. I remember basically, so in Java, a lot of students are like testing getters and setters, and then they hate it. And it makes sense, right? That they hate it because it's a stupid test. There's nothing interesting in that test, but they don't learn. So most of the time it's not very well taught, because the point of test is that it solves problem, and it solves problem that I haven't met. So it's quite complicated, because both of you mentioned some very emotional thinkings. You said I was miserable. That is a strong word. And Pablo, you mentioned something about chaos and switching concept. And you did not use any emotional wording, but I think like we've all had those hectic day, switching contexts and getting overwhelmed. This is the emotional word, getting overwhelmed with being lost, not knowing where we were at. And I think like testing the right way, not testing with the right tool, testing the right way, it brings peace of mind. But that peace of mind and those hectic days, they're not felt by students most of the time, or at least not for those reasons. They are overwhelmed with the amount of knowledge, of technical knowledge they have to bring in. So it's very difficult to make them feel what is the right way to test. And small parenthesis, because not the best, I don't know if it's the best, but a very important book I read about testing was actually using Java, and not because I was teaching it, was using Java examples. And for me, it was lovely because my main language was Ruby. It was lovely to have a book use Java examples, because it helped me dissociate the language from the concept. And that book was Growing Object-Oriented Software Guided by Test. It's a mouthful, but I would highly recommend. I think it's a pretty old book, so some examples might be a bit old, but lovely book, a ton of concepts, ton of examples, and yeah, highly recommended.
We are doing some promotion. Yeah, okay. Like I remember learning a lot about testing also using Upcase videos. They are from Thoughtbot actually. And they are that's why it's a bit of self-promotion. But they are actually pretty good. It helped me a lot to understand all the concepts and how to approach testing. And I think it was one of the first books, first videos I watched. And then there is something in Udemy for RSpec as well, but now I don't remember exactly the details, but I can share them with you later, Pablo. That it also helped me a lot to learn RSpec in this case specifically.
Yeah, I think I did also one in Udemy. And Philippe, I was smiling while you were talking about the growing object-oriented software guided by tests, because it's one of the few physical books I have in my library. One of the first books I bought once I decided that with a bootcamp I did not have enough knowledge to be the professional I wanted to be. I had a good start, but not. And I agree wholeheartedly with that recommendation. Do you always test first?
When I know what I'm going, okay, so can I answer first? Test first when I have at least a small idea of what I intend to achieve, which is like 99% of the time. But when I'm doing like really technological exploration, I'm not testing first because I have no idea what I'm doing, where I'm going. It doesn't even matter because I'm exploring, right? The whole point is I want to know how a tool works or how a library works. So I'm not gonna constrain myself because that is the point of examples, is guidelining, like safeguarding me. I don't want to safeguard me because I have no idea what the landscape looks like. So in those cases, I'm not testing first because I'm not testing at all. So I think I'm testing first every time I intend to test at all.
Fair enough. And you, Jose?
Yeah, I would say pretty similar. Like again, like if I'm doing an investigation on how to do something that I have no clue about, I normally don't approach it with test first because again, it's something I know it won't go into production or it's gonna stay like that, just a investigation, a hobby or a side project I'm doing just for the sake of learning or just to know how something works. I could say maybe if you have a very small script that you are 100% sure of what it's doing, perhaps you don't need tests for that, but something very, 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 very specific. But I have to say that even in some projects when we were creating spikes, but of course, because we knew already the context of the system where we were trying to investigate that feature we were trying to do, we were also writing tests along the spike, and then it helped a lot, obviously, with the final development of it, because then you have already some tests in place and some code that you will use in the final version of the feature if it happens. But I would say also sometimes when I do my breakable toys, I'm like, okay, I'm not gonna do tests. I just want to to experiment and create something, and if it's something that I can see, I can move forward and maybe deploy, then I will go back and say, okay, let me start writing some tests and start again properly. But yeah, not always. Like we are not that hard.
I say, may I ask, you mentioned spikes a couple of times. I'm not familiar with that concept. When you said spikes, what do you mean?
When I say spike, it means coding something just to investigate how that thing will work, that feature. So let's say you want to implement again a welcome page, silly, silly example, and you don't know how to do it at all because you are using a new technology or whatever. You will start by creating some code implementing that investigation of how to do that welcome page, and it's something that it won't go into production. It's just some code that at some point you will throw,
Hmm.
and that's it. So that's what I call a spike. Like, yeah, I don't know. Maybe investigation would be like another word.
No, fair enough. I just wasn't familiar with the concept, so I wasn't.
What you said is super interesting, and I relate to that. Like the last sentence you said is like, I intend to throw it away anyway. So basically you intend to have zero maintenance on that. So like test would be in the way and test help with maintenance, but no maintenance, maybe not needed to do any test, not needed to do any of the high quality code neither, because the whole point of code quality is help with maintenance. So if you want to do like a single function with 1500 lines, you don't care, you're going to throw it away anyway.
And yeah, I don't know what other. To be honest, I think that will be the cases.
I think I have one more case because before I joined NodeView, so I was working in an agency. I intervened like in a lot of projects, sometimes greenfield projects, sometimes very legacy projects. And very legacy projects sometimes are not easy to test, not testable. They were not test first. And I don't like Big Bang. I don't like tell anybody, first I'm going to do nothing visible for 3 months because I'm going to write a way to make your code testable, and then I will be able to do one feature. Like maybe after 3 months, I will be able to change the color of that button. But first, I need to test it. It's not reasonable. That's not how to be a good professional. So my point on those occasions is like, okay, how can I make it more testable? Maybe it's not going to be entirely testable, but how can it be more testable? So maybe I will be able to introduce RSpec, but only be able to test very specific subject, very small subject, maybe only like one method, like only the new method I'm going to add to some object, but maybe not like the database interaction, maybe not the routing system, maybe not like blah, 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 blah. But the point is, if something is not testable at all, then making it a little bit testable is already a step forward. So that's like one additional situation where I would not entirely test. And the other one is copy and most of the UI stuff. So when I write acceptance test, the way we do it, we basically inject in test environment additional data parameters in HTML tags. Those are not at all rendered on production or staging. And this is the way we can identify HTML elements, like I want to click this, I want to move that, I want to type something here. So I'm never identifying an HTML element using CSS selector or using copy, background color, you name it. I'm never going to say, oh, I'm going to click on the blue button. And it's not an accident. I don't want my test. I don't want anything to be a test to break, to go red, because the new blue is slightly darker than the old blue. This is for me not a right way to break a test. So I'm never testing anything related to those stuff that I want to be able to change without raising an alarm.
You stole part of the question that was coming to my head, which was I had two of them and you stole both of them actually. First, do you test the UX front end part of your code? And the second was, how do you handle untestable code? So we have Philippe's answer. Jose, care to answer one, two, or both?
Yeah, in terms of front end, you mean like, because for example, the way I'm used to do front end, like some project is with view components that definitely is testable and you can test the behavior of the components you are using in your front end. What Philip was describing about colors, etc. I have to be honest, like I never seen a test asserting this is red or blue or the background is yellow. I don't know if that's something, but if it exists, I never seen it. I never even thought about it unless it's part of the behavior of the application. Let's say that something happens and the background color changes. I don't know if I will test that as part of the behavior of that part of the application. Untestable code, yeah, I guess in this case, yeah, what Philippe mentioned is quite fair. In terms of what I test in the front end, yeah, through view components, I think you can test basically anything you want in your front end. Yeah, that will be.
To be fair, you said you've never seen a test asserting button is green. I've written tests not
Yeah, okay.
button of is green, but page title is name of thing, right?
Oh, but hold on. Again, if you have some behavior where you have different page titles depending, for example, on the user, you can explicitly test that and expect. But if you have a page title saying hello, and you test that it's always hello, and it's static, then
It's
yeah.
very nice of you to try to save me. It was the second case. It's what we were saying about the steep learning curve, right? I think at least in my case, part of what teaches or part of what guides my answer to what should you test, when should you test, how should you test is scar tissue, because I made those mistakes, right? Because I made a test that would assert that the page was hello, and then the page did not have to be hello, had to be goodbye, and I had to change a test for something that was static that made no sense, right?
And honestly speaking, at the beginning of my career, I will struggle so much. I remember at my first job, like writing first test with, I received that I was picking up a ticket and then I will jump straight away into the code and then the testing part. I was like, oh my God, how do I test this now? Because I was so unsure of how to approach it at the beginning of my career that it made me uncomfortable. I was having like this kind of, oh, I don't have the knowledge I know how to implement it, but I don't know how to test it. And it was bothering me because I was like, but it's working.
Yeah.
So now I need to write these tests and I don't know how to do it. I don't know. So yeah, it's difficult. It's not something easy to learn and grasp.
And was that something that was solved because you started writing tests first, or did you learn to test and then started writing tests first?
I would say I had really good mentors. I was lucky in the two companies I've been a software developer. I was lucky having really good people around me and mentors. And of course, I knew the advantages of doing tests first. It was just maybe a gap of knowledge what's making me uncomfortable. And I also maybe perhaps at the beginning you always want to show that you're capable of doing something, right? That you know how to code and create something. And then kind of tests in my head were coming after knowing how to code, but it's actually the other way. Well, it's complementary, I guess. So I think through experience, courses, and obviously the most important thing, I think people around you who advocates for the good processes and patterns and culture. And that way is how I learn test-driven development. I would say I'm still learning, of course, like not saying I'm super expert, like still learning every day.
Of course. Do you guys keep all the tests you write whilst you're developing?
No. I'm writing many specs when I'm developing because the point is to get the code design. So I want to maybe like I have this rabbit hole, right? I go down, and at some point I realize that I have the system spec that triggers interactor that triggers I don't know a service that triggers like API authentication, and I'm like, okay, I want to API authentication. Like most of the time, it's gonna succeed, but I want to be sure that I properly handle the exception, right? Like, and because the documentation of the API says that sometimes it returns, I don't know, like 500, 400, whatever. Like, so I'm going to write a test because I'm currently writing this piece of code. So I'm ready. I know that when I'm going to write the code, I'm going to write that rescue statement. So I'm not going to write that rescue statement if I have no spec actually messaging and going through that piece of code. So I'm going to write the specs that emulates somehow the error from the network. I'm happy with my code. But then at the end of my red-green refactor, I will really deeply think about what test do I still want to keep? What would be an actual regression? And those ideas I'm combining because I very often also have very similar specs, like they're very slightly different. I wanted to write a new one because I didn't want to hack my previous one. So I wrote like very nuanced and small variation about the same ideas, but I'm not gonna keep all of them. So I have this phase where I'm basically collecting all the spec. I'm reading again everything that I wrote, and then I'm thinking which of these are actually gonna make my non-regression the stuff that I keep for history. So it's a different story. I'm writing a lot of stuff because it helps me write the code, and I'm keeping, but not only keeping, reshaping some of it as a non-regression.
There's a very similar, maybe perhaps if let's say I write a life cycle test, would mean I'm a user, I register, then I sign in, then I buy something, then I return something, then I buy something again, and then I receive 20 emails on the way. Imagine I have a life cycle test like that it goes the whole life of the product of your object. And then at some point I have system tests for each part of the app, and then obviously all the unit tests for each of the logic behind all those parts, then that lifecycle test I will throw it away because it's very expensive. I will keep the ones that they are faster and I'm confident enough I'm covering each part of the flow with those tests.
Is there a trick to that? Because I find that when I do test first, the main failing I have is that I do my tests and I strive to make them clear. I strive to make it one example per it, etc., etc., etc. But I struggle to see the big picture after. So I struggle to see which ones I take away, because reading the examples, especially if the code was not testable and you had to massage in the bad way the code to make the tests, can get quite messy, quite verbose. If you just read the enunciate, and if you read the 200, 300 lines, I get lost. Is there a trick to that for you?
We almost never read like the whole test example. Imagine that someone else has wrote something test first. So there's a lot of tests, there's a lot of code, and then maybe my job is to introduce some new feature in that code or new change. It's very unlikely that I'm gonna read all specs and all examples of that. Also, I will likely read the system one. It gives me enough context, like, oh, does this feature, like, is it related to any users, power users, whatever, like, it will give me context. And then I will start writing immediately what I think I need to do. But I'm missing so much knowledge at that point that I'm going to make a ton of mistakes. And it doesn't matter. I'm still writing the spec of what I currently understand is the stuff I need to do. And then this is just, it starts the machine, right? Like, I'm running my test, it's read, I'm getting into some code. Maybe I will like try to find the test, that exercise that specific aspect of the code. But test first, I believe it might not be the best name, because it gives the idea that you write the test. It's a very good test. You're happy with it. So now it's set in stone, and now you write the code until it's very good, and now it's set in stone. So you refactor it because whatever reason it's set in stone, and then you go to the next. This feels like waterfall with some extra steps. So for me, test first is not like that. Test first just says start the machine. It's a very iterative machine. Like, there's a lot of back and forth, but simply like the first character you're gonna write is gonna be on the test side, on the example side. But as soon as you have written a few characters and run that stuff, it's back and forth and back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And examples, they do serve as documentation. I fully agree with that. They do serve as documentation when you change something and then it's read again, and then you get very contextualized documentation about what exactly did you just break.
I would say if you struggle thinking if your test should be deleted, and maybe perhaps it means that it's actually a test that you should keep. That if you think, oh, should I delete it or not? Like, if you're not sure, like, maybe actually the test is fulfilling a purpose of, okay, I need to be here. Just keep it, because back on your head, you think that it's actually useful and you shouldn't delete it, I guess. Again, unit tests, for example, like, they are so fast normally, like, if they are well written, isolated, like, doesn't harm to have tests in there.
I think we finally disagree. And,
Yeah.
Okay,
It was a bait, actually.
yeah, maybe. But I'm the other opinion. If you're not sure whether you should keep or delete a test, I'm in the camp of you should delete it if you're not sure. You should never have any piece of code or test that you're not sure is useful. And if you did it properly, and you means you and your team and everybody who is actually hands in the code base, if everybody is doing their job properly, the code is testable. So whatever test you delete, you will be able to like recreate it in the light of new knowledge. And I'm not saying that you should delete everything. I'm just saying that if you, after like a small investigation or thorough investigation, but you're not sure like what is the usefulness of something on the code side or on the test side, I'm in the camp of delete it. And if it was useful, like recreate it when you better understand what was the usefulness.
Were you convinced, Paulo, who was the...
Before you start disagreeing too much and this becomes a bloodbath, because that was a big disagreement. I'm sadly noticing the clock now, and we're very close to an hour. So I'm going to start winding down, and I'm going to ask you one last question, which is, what would you recommend to someone that is interested by example driven development or test driven development? and doesn't know where to start, what would you recommend for that person?
Like from my perspective, because it's what it helped me, like having, if you can have like a friend or someone that can mentor you and guide you through the journey, that's invaluable. Like it's priceless to me, more than, I mean, then you can read documentation, books, watch videos, etc. But having someone with you reviewing your PRs, like having a breakable toy where you approach something with test-driven development, and then having a friend or a mentor reviewing your PRs and saying, oh, this looks good, but oh, yes, not bad, but you could improve on this or that's basically like a priceless, my point of view. And then practice, and yeah, read as much as you can or watch videos nowadays, or TikToks. For sure, there are TikToks about testing. I don't know, I don't have TikTok, but I'm pretty sure there are TikToks about it. But yeah, that would be like my first super fast suggestion advice.
I fully agree with the advice. I believe pairing and social interaction makes a lot of it. I would add maybe start small. Like even if you believe test is going to save the world and it's going to save your 40,000 lines project, don't start with your 40,000 lines project. Start small. Ideally start on a greenfield project. And practice. And I would add read, especially if you're using an interpreted language like Ruby. Everything is accessible. All the gems are accessible. Some of them are crazy high quality. So read, because as we are writers, and all writers in every possible job read more than they write. We are the only ones who believe that we should write more than we read. So you want to learn? Read.
And listen to this podcast as well.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, both of you, for having been here. Thank you very much for what was a very illuminating and entertaining episode.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.